Hi, everyone. What if your child doesn't speak? Does that mean they don't understand you? Recently, a parent asked me a heartbreaking question about her 3-year-old son who has Dravet syndrome. She said, is there any point in trying to communicate with him if he can't respond? My answer was simple. Never assume silence means absence of understanding. Let me explain why that assumption can change everything about how we support children who communicate differently. So her son had Dravet syndrome, which is a severe form of epilepsy. And I've had several children with that particular syndrome in the school that I've been head of, been deputy head of, assistant head of. We've had several children with Dravet syndrome, which is certainly involves periods, episodes of extreme epilepsy, similar to West syndrome, really. And I've had several children with West syndrome in my schools. So it's a severe form of epilepsy, and the doctors suspected that he might have profound and multiple learning difficulties, and it seemed to be the label that they were giving him. Like many parents in this situation, she felt uncertain about how to communicate with him. She asked a very honest question. She asked me, was it even necessary? And was it pointless if he couldn't seem to respond to her? And that's a question many parents quietly ask themselves. Her son doesn't speak. Sometimes he appears to be in his own world. But she also told me something very important. Every now and then, he looks at her in a way that makes her feel that he wants her to understand something. And that one observation told me everything I needed to know. If a child looks at you as though they want to communicate, then we must never, ever assume that they have nothing to say. One of the most important principles I shared was this: always assume a child can understand more than he can express. In fact, I often say to parents, assume that your child may be cleverer than you, but simply can't show it. Communication is not just speech. Communication includes eye contact, facial expression, body movement, vocal sound, changes in breathing, and movements of shared attention. These are all forms of interaction. When I asked this parent how she spoke, to her son, she reflected very honestly. She said she had fallen into the habit of speaking to him in the same way she spoke to her 6-month-old baby, because her 3-year-old son was wheelchair bound, often in a seated position. Maybe she even put him in a high chair constantly, even though he was 3. And she realized that she was speaking to him in the same way she was speaking to her younger son, who didn't have the syndrome, didn't have Dravet syndrome, but was only 6 months old. And she realized before she spoke to me that she probably needed to change that. And that realization actually is very powerful. Children who cannot speak still deserve rich language around them. They deserve to hear conversation, tone, humour, storytelling. Even if they can't respond with words, their brains are still listening and learning. The parent also wondered whether her son could hear what was happening around him: the television, conversations in the house, family discussions. My answer was simple, obviously. Unless a child has been diagnosed with a hearing difficulty, we should assume that they can hear the world around them just as we can. Just like any of us, they may sometimes choose to listen and sometimes choose to tune things out. But hearing the rhythm of conversation and language is part of how humans, how their communication develops. Another important thing we discussed was not becoming fixed on a diagnostic label. Sometimes when parents hear the term PMLD, profound multiple learning difficulties, it can unexpectedly shape their expectations in a negative way. Diagnosis can help professionals organise support, but they should never define what a child may or may not achieve. I mentioned the remarkable story of Jonathan Bryan, who was once assumed to have very limited understanding because he couldn't speak or move easily. Through patient support and alternative communication methods, it became clear that he had far more understanding than people had assumed. And I communicated with Jonathan through email and used his amazing poem about PMLD in one of my books available from Amazon on Routledge. Just Google my name, you'll shouldn't say Google, search engine my name. Stories like this remind us we must always keep the door to communication open. In this conversation with the parent, we also talked about intensive interaction. This is a powerful approach where adults join the child's world rather than expecting the child to immediately join ours. If a child makes a sound, you copy it. If they move, you respond. You may mirror that movement. Over time, that back and forth builds trust and shared attention, and it's the foundations of communication. So that interaction is extremely valuable. I also encourage the use of simple signing, gestures, and vocalizations. There's some brilliant things that you can watch. There are many videos and TV, what's it called, CBBS. I'm keeping myself a script here for me because I'm going off tangent again. I got to be so careful because I could talk about so many things. So let's get back to where I was. So I also encourage the use of simple signing, gestures, and vocalizations. Even if a child can't produce signs themselves, seeing signs alongside speech can help build understanding. What matters most is that the adult remains curious, patient, and responsive. We also touched briefly on something very hopeful in the world of medical research because there are new treatments for Dravet syndrome, including medication therapy currently being studied called Zorevunersen, Zorevunersen, and that is showing promise in reducing seizure frequencies. And if you use a search engine, you will find some fabulous recent stories, because it was only either earlier this year or late last year that this has been brought to the public's attention. So for families living with severe epilepsy, this kind of progress brings genuine hope. You know, I've worked with so many families where epilepsy is a massive part of their condition. But regardless of medical advances, the most important thing we can offer children is belief in their potential to connect with us. Children who communicate differently are often described under the broad umbrella of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity simply recognizes that human brains do not all work in the same way. So, as I've said many times before, neurodiversity is not a diagnosis, it's a social umbrella for brains that work differently, that are not typical. And these include so many. They're not just diagnosis, say, of autism or ADHD. All right, neurodiversity is a much broader umbrella encompassing Dravet syndrome. So some people process language, sensory input, and social interaction differently from what we might consider as typical. A child who does not speak is still part of that neurodiverse world. Their brain is working differently. But that does not mean that their inner world, which I've the videos on here that I've made of the inner world and outer worlds, it does not mean that their inner world is empty. It simply means we must sometimes work harder to find ways to meet them where they are. The message I would like parents and practitioners to take away is this: never assume silence means absence of understanding. Never assume a diagnosis defines a child's potential. Look at Jonathan Bryant, amazing. Unfortunately, he died last year, age 17, but what a brilliant mind. And never stop trying to communicate. Sometimes the smallest moments, a shared glance, a repeated sound, a brief exchange, are the beginnings of a meaningful connection. Communication is not a test that children must pass. It's a relationship that adults must nurture. Thank you for listening. If you are supporting a child who does not yet speak, remember this: communication is not just about words, it is about connection. It is about patience, curiosity, and belief in the child in front of you. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to believe that a child has nothing to say and can't participate in this world of ours, because they can. If you found this helpful, you may also find my other videos useful, where I talk about communication, sensory understanding, behaviours, supporting neurodivergent children in practical ways. I have posts on YouTube, longer videos on YouTube, shorts on YouTube. I've also got a website, and YouTube points you to that. Plus other social media outlets. Please consider subscribing to this channel so that more parents and practitioners can find this information. And if you know a parent who's wondering whether their child understands them, share this video with them. It might give them the confidence to keep trying.